Bonjour à tous. Merci d'être venus. Je vais parler en anglais parce que Abbad ne parle pas français très bien. So I need to speak in English. Thank you everyone for being here. I am happy to represent Abbad DIRANEYYA, who come from Wikimedia Foundation. Abbad is the knowledge manager of the strategy of the movement strategy in the Wikimedia Foundation, and he will be here presenting the linguistic challenge in creating multilingual content for Wikipedia. Abbad is very active in Wikipedia projects. I knew him since 5 or 6 years, and he's mainly active in Arabic Wikipedia, but he's also working with as I said, as a full-time employee for the Wikimedia Foundation, and we are very happy to have him here in Istia. So I will give him the speech, and again, thank you everyone to be here.
Thank you for having me. And first of all, I have to apologize for speaking in English. I am working on my French. It's not great. I have took a few classes, like A2. But yeah, not there yet. So as Michelle said, I'm as a volunteer Wikimedian. I've been a volunteer for 13 years writing on Wikipedia, but it's also my full-time job to work on the global strategy of Wikimedia. So today I will speak a bit about those topics, and I will move here to our agenda. So our topic will be generally about the challenges of working with many languages in open knowledge. This will take Wikipedia as a case study, but also will be a bit general. The topic is also related to translation studies and linguistics in general, which will be one of the things that I'm going to talk about as a subject that I have expertise in, and also I have a book about translation, by the way, but it's in Arabic, unfortunately. And yeah, this will be the focus for today. So I will not talk only about Wikipedia or introduce the general concepts of Wikipedia, although I'm happy to take questions about that. But I will be more focused on the challenges we're facing in working across many languages, which I hope that will be something interesting for such a linguistically diverse region, and also for the interest in Basque language. And we, by the way, have local Wikimedians here who write on Wikipedia in Basque. Sorry for calling you out without letting you know before. But yeah. So the main topic for today will be about those challenges we have in working with many languages and what we might be able to do about it. But first, let's start with the concept of free knowledge, which is what Wikipedia is about, but free knowledge is also not limited to Wikipedia. We can find it in other things. And just to introduce free knowledge quickly, the word free here doesn't refer to something that is free, as in free supermarket items, for example. It's more meant to be about free licensing or something that is legally free. This means that the content on Wikipedia and on other free knowledge sources is something that that is not only free to access, but it's also something that can be freely adapted, reused, republished. So for example, you can take articles from Wikipedia, print them in a book, and publish that book. And you can even sell it. And this is allowed by law because it's free. So this is the idea of openness. We do not just want people to reach the content, we also want them to use it and to build upon it to develop this knowledge. So this is what free knowledge is about. One other aspect is that the open knowledge comes from the open movement or the open source movement, which also started in software if you use things like Firefox or Linux or many other things, chances are you're using open source software, which are also programs, computer programs that have a completely free code that anyone can access and build upon. And it's part of how we want everyone to have equal access rather than restricting things by money or corporations. So that was a very quick introduction about free knowledge, which comprises all Wikipedia content. So Wikipedia is completely freely licensed. It also applies to other things, but I will not go to that in depth right now. But let's also move to our joint topic for today, because we're not only talking about free knowledge, but about linguistic challenges. And this requires talking a little bit about multilingualism in the world, which, as someone who studied languages, I find a very interesting topic. So, we will not dive deep into this, but this is an interesting map. It shows how linguistically diverse our world is, although it is becoming quickly less diverse, as we will say in a moment. So statistics say that we have about 7,100 languages in the world spoken overall right now. Most of those languages may not be so familiar to you because they are actually spoken by few people, and the majority of the world are dominated by just a few of those languages. So while we have 7,000 languages across the world, the languages that are actually used in the daily lives of people are much, much less. And so as you might be familiar, there are those few languages that dominate most things in the world, and this graphic shows us some of them. So actually only 23 languages are spoken by half of the world's population, and the other 7,000 are spoken by the other half. And yeah, it's way more disproportionate, but we'll come to that. One thing worth noting is that most of the 7,100 languages that are spoken by half of the world are unfortunately on their way to extinction. This diversity is dwindling very, very quickly. There's an estimation that every 2 weeks, one language in the world goes extinct. So yeah, when we think that Basque language may be facing challenges, it may not be as bad as also other languages in the world that are very challenged. And in this infographic, we can see 10 of the least spoken languages. And those icons of 1 person and 2 persons mean literally that there are only 2 persons remaining in the world who speak that language, unfortunately. This, however, is not a coincidence. It's related to the natural way that languages develop and get integrated into each other. So a trend in the world that has been happening for centuries is that major standard languages are replacing the smaller languages and taking their space. And so if you are speaking a minority language and you can communicate with only 100 people, chances are you will need to learn another major language to be able to get education or work or other things. And I'm just using this example from the local proximity because it shows how all this diversity does exist even here, but it's also facing many challenges because it's getting challenged by the major or dominant languages in the region. This is also no coincidence because, as we say, there are many advantages to speaking a language that is more common than a minority language. But there's also a very clear correlation in how much knowledge you can access. And as Sir Francis Bacon tells us, and also Michel Foucault, by the way, knowledge is power. And so in order to have access to this power, you will need to have access to knowledge. And in order to have access to knowledge, you will need to speak a language that offers you a lot of knowledge. And here we see in this graphic very clear correlation between the amount of knowledge or content that currently exists on the internet with the number of speakers of each language. So pretty much if you do not speak one of those very major languages, you may not have access to anything at all. This brings us to the question of the internet. And this is not only because free knowledge has been mainly thriving on the internet lately, but because our main source of knowledge now is the internet. Whenever we want to access something, We Google it, we look for it somewhere online, and then we try to find it. And in theory, the great thing about the internet is that it's supposed to support just about any language, or that's what we would suppose, because it's a free environment. Anyone can add the content they want themselves. That's what Wikipedia is all about, and what many other websites on the internet are about. But the question is, how many languages can we really have on the internet right now? There is a report, a very great report, by the way, if you're interested to dive deeper into this. It's called State of the Internet Languages. It has been created by a partnership between the Oxford Internet Institute, between teams of the Wikimedia Foundation and of other organizations. And it tells us how, what is the current realities of languages on the internet. And it mainly tells us that they are way less than even the poor diversity that we're having in the real world. So to start with, to have a language online, it's usually important to have it written, or to have a script for it, because most knowledge remains written nowadays, or that's the most academically approved kind of knowledge, since we are in an academic institution. And one sad fact is that half of the world languages cannot even be written, because they simply don't have written scripts. That's not something they are allowed. And in this map, we can see some of the different scripts around the world, and most of them are dominated by the Latin alphabet, although we have lots of linguistic diversity in non-Latin languages in many of those regions. When we look at the internet overall, we find that 3 out of 4 people on the internet are using it in one of 10 very major languages that are really dominant. And on the left side of the screen, you can see those dominant languages by the number of internet users, while on the right side, you can see the amount of content in those languages. It is not always correlating. So as you see, Chinese is by far the top language by the number of users, but it has much less content than, say, English or Russian. One other very major issue is that, or one direct actually consequence of this is that we have relatively very few languages that are supported even on the largest websites on the internet. So here you can see probably some familiar names like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and also some more educational websites like Duolingo or Coursera. And it shows the amount of languages supported on each of those websites. And this is an analysis of some of the top websites on the internet. So those are not your average websites. But still, very few of them can ever exceed 50 languages, or 100 at most. And seeing the vast amount of languages in the world, 7,000, as we have said at the beginning, this may be very little. So the average of languages supported by the largest websites, according to one analysis, is only 30. And the largest, some of the largest ones like Google reach about 100 to 150. But we do have a somewhat exceptional case here in Wikipedia, which is why we will zoom in on Wikipedia in a bit, which supports over 300, which is still very little compared to how many languages we have in the world, but it's doing pretty good compared to the usual. Wikipedia is very multilingual, although again, it still supports a small portion of the languages that exist in the world, but it actually has a lot of content in a lot of languages. So we have 70 languages with 100,000 articles and counting. We have over 160 languages with at least 10,000 articles. So this is pretty decent content in a lot of languages that outside Wikipedia gets very little presence on the internet. So what makes Wikipedia different? Why do we have this much content in this many languages that we usually do not see anywhere? Well, first of all, we have a vision for Wikipedia. It's rather ambitious, but that's why it's a vision. It's not something that is necessarily going to happen because it might be impossible, but this is what we strive towards. So Wikipedia's vision, by the words of Wikipedia's founder, Jimmy Wales, is towards a world in which every single human being can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. And the sum of all knowledge would really mean the sum of all knowledge in every language, which seems very far-fetched, but this is where we would hope to be someday. And this brings us to what Wikipedia is, because if we want Wikipedia to contain the sum of human knowledge for everyone, then we may need to understand first how Wikipedia is working and how it might be going towards this goal and what makes it able to support so many languages. So the word Wikipedia itself, and forgive me here, I'm a bit into linguistics, so I would like to go to the origins of words. It comes from two parts. The first is wiki, which is a word from Hawaiian language. This is one aspect of linguistic diversity in Wikipedia. The word originally means quick, but now it is meant to refer to collaboration and to working together. So Wikipedia, as you may or may not know, is open to everyone. So any of you actually can just jump in and edit something on Wikipedia or create a new article or fix a mistake if you happen to run into one. The other part of the name is pedia, short for encyclopedia. And this is the part that refers to the type of knowledge that Wikipedia contains. And just as a quick fact, there are many other wiki websites that are based on the same collaborative model, although they are not an encyclopedia. So Wikipedia's content is pretty much like what you will find in a written encyclopedia, although it is usually more. But we also have wiki-based dictionaries, wiki-based repositories for news, for quotations, for data, for files. So if you go to Wikidata, for example, you would find millions of data entries, one of the largest databases online. In Wikimedia Commons, you can find millions of freely licensed pictures and videos. So wiki refers to a lot of things. And the important part here is that Wikipedia is managed by a community. So it is not a corporation. It's actually, there's only, with the Wikimedia Foundation is just a non-profit organization that supports Wikipedia. And otherwise, the whole website is run by a community. And this community is open, which means that anyone who speaks any language can just jump in and add their language. So this is the thing about Wikipedia. There is a clear process that welcomes, at least in theory, any language, whether minor or major, to start their own Wikipedia language. There's a website called The Incubator where those are hosted. You can check it out online if you're interested, or if you have a language that you would like to add to Wikipedia that does not exist yet. And the basic process is that once it's ensured that there is a sufficient number of volunteers who are interested in this language and who can start a community, a new Wikipedia can directly be launched. And this explains why we have so many languages on Wikipedia and so much content in those languages. However, this is just the beginning of the story, so it does not end here. It's true that Wikipedia is very flexible in allowing any language, including minority languages, to start a new project and to translate the entire Wikipedia interface to their language. But that's only the beginning, because Wikipedia isn't really about just having a website online. It's about having the content. And populating the content in a new language or a small language has a whole lot of challenges that people may not usually think about or consider. So a lot of the wikis, of the smaller language wikis that start, tend to stop at around 1,000 articles, and they have a hard time going over that. About half of Wikipedia languages, I think, or about 1/3, are still under 1,000 articles. And this is due to a number of challenges that I'm going to try to quickly tackle here. But I'm also, we will also have a discussion section where some of you might want to also talk about the challenges that you know yourselves. So some of the first things that come to mind when trying to create a new encyclopedia in a language in which knowledge has never been written is vocabulary. And the challenge here is that Wikipedia in English and in other major European languages is based on the basic notion that you have sources, and like you have books, you have journals, you have many other sources of knowledge that you're just gonna collect and put in Wikipedia articles because they already exist in your language. But for smaller languages, those sources can be non-existent, and so they need to start by translation, and they soon run into the barrier that there is just not sufficient vocabulary. There is a very large vocabulary in English and in some Latin languages that have been built specifically for sciences, for technology, for other growing fields that do not exist in other languages because this kind of knowledge simply does not exist in those languages yet. And this is a major challenge because while a volunteer community can dedicate their free time to start a new Wikipedia and to translate content or to try to collect sources, they are not necessarily able or are not basically able to create enough vocabulary to supply such topics that have thousands of new terms that get added each year to English or to other languages that are leading in academics. So there's very little vocabulary in those languages for specialized or technical topics. And when it comes to science, they usually run behind. And this is where they have to improvise. There are many problems about improvising, but one of the things that we run daily into, even in a language that is somewhat widespread or that is actually top 5 languages in the world, like Arabic, is that for those technological terms that are missing for us, we just have to improvise. And so one common problem in Wikipedias in also smaller languages is that maybe every few weeks or even few days, the editors will start arguing about the proper translation for a new term or for the title of an article that they are trying to create that has never had a translation in their language. And so how can you translate an article about something that doesn't even have a name in your language? This means you will need to improvise and to discuss with other editors. And usually those improvisations lead to very different results because it's based on a case-by-case basis. So one of the things that happened, for example, in Arabic is that when computers were first introduced and the language institutions were keen on finding terms, proper terms to describe them, each language institution in each Arabic-speaking country started to find out their own proper translation for this new term. And now we have ended up with more or less a dozen different translations for this word. I'm not going to put the terms there because they're just going to be meaningless to you, but many of them come from completely different routes that are trying to find out the best possible alternative for this word in Arabic. And this means that we lack standards and we lack universal terms. We can use completely different terms to talk about the exact same thing. We have another issue here, which is that when we are trying to introduce those new terms, like the new word for computer, it is really meaningless unless those new terms are being used. This is why we have currently a dozen words for computer, because none of those words became prevalent enough to become universally recognized in Arabic. And this happens, of course, in many other languages. And so when you coin a new term or introduce a new vocabulary to a language, it is not only about finding the right term, but about people actually using that term. And here we have a little bit of the chicken and the egg problem, which is what came first. The problem is that for people to start using a new term or a new vocabulary and to be familiar with it, you will need a lot of content that describes that term and that people can read to get used to it, to know what it is. However, if you don't have the vocabulary yet, how can you create content about those things? And this is the paradox in any topic related to science or technology especially, but also to many, many topics overall in smaller languages. When it comes to something that is as large and overarching as Wikipedia, you can write about anything there, from video games to physics to galaxies, and then you run into all those terms that you need, that you don't know how to translate, so you're frustrated and you cannot create content. And if you don't create content, you'll never have terms for those topics. So we are a volunteer community. We're not able to deal with such linguistic problems ourselves. Those are very complicated for us. So we sometimes try to resort to the sources of authority that are supposed to solve such linguistic issues, and the most common source here would be dictionaries. Unfortunately, however, dictionaries are a privilege, and they are not something that every language has. And when they have it, it's usually in much different quality than major languages are used to. So I call this the equivalent of Oxford, because Oxford is kind of the go-to point, although in English alone you have dozens of other dictionaries that are almost just as good. And the exceptional thing about major dictionaries like Oxford is that they really have this comprehensiveness where just about any term that you need exists there, but not only the term, you can only find you can find the term's history, you can find through a thesaurus what are the synonyms of that term to help you find alternatives for the words and to help you use language better. Those things simply do not exist for other languages. Historical dictionaries, even in Arabic, which is spoken by almost 500 million people, still do not exist. There's no single equivalent of Oxford in Arabic language. And for smaller languages, it can be much, much more challenging because you don't even have a single reference where all the terms of this language are documented. And when it comes to technical terms, the bilingual dictionaries that are supposed to help you translate such terms are very rare on one hand, and they lack all the standards and universality that we have talked about. So even when you run into a dictionary that, for example, helps you translate terms about agriculture, chances are that the new terms introduced in this dictionary are just coined by one author and are not used by anyone else. So all of those are some of the linguistic challenges that a community of volunteers may face when trying to create content or knowledge in a new language. There are also some issues of trying to make knowledge multilingual or provide it in other languages in general that I would like to run quickly into. And I just want to highlight those issues because we generally think of creating new content and of translation specifically as a good thing for new languages that lack the content and that we can relatively easily supply with content by just translating from others. And through the years, through working in volunteer communities of translation, we have run into many issues that are actually very problematic about this dependency on making content or knowledge multilingual. And one of the most principal issues, which is probably familiar to many or all of you, is shifts in meaning, which are usually accidental, but sometimes they are just inevitable. One of the words that describes such shifts is explication in translation studies, which is a term that means that when you want to translate a word, instead of translating that word, you simply explain it. And so maybe instead of translating the word computer by using a single word in, let's say, Twi language, you may replace it with a sentence that describes what a computer is, because you just cannot translate the word computer into anything meaningful. And this means that the text becomes longer on one hand. It also becomes more difficult to digest because single terms turn into sentences. But more importantly, it does change the meaning because a word is not supposed to be a sentence. That's a linguistic shift. Another much more common issue is the loss of nuances because when translating and when you have when you're translating into a language with less specialized terms, you will it tends to be very difficult to maintain the specific meanings or the nuances in terms. And some of the examples here for words in English that might be very difficult to translate to small languages is things like words that connotate to similar meanings like develop, evolve, advance. Those things in English can have completely different meanings based on the context. So it can be anything from the theory of evolution of animals and species to the development of economies, for example, and all of those words get to be blended together into a single term or a single translation in smaller languages that cannot afford such specific nuances. One issue that comes usually from translators, of course, and is the most common issue maybe in translation, is simply misinterpretation or miscommunication of meaning. This is really common, and I'm sure we can have tons of examples for it. For example, all of those memes about how Google Translate makes silly mistakes when translating things. One slightly more sophisticated and interesting example that I have once found when reading the translation of a book by Richard Feynman is how words with multiple meanings or with metaphorical and literal meanings can easily be confused. And in this example, there's this passage from a book describing Richard Feynman talking to, he's a physicist, by the way, a famous physicist. I think you know him because you're at technical school. So he is talking to a friend of him who is an artist, and they have those different views or opinions about something. And then in the translation, it came out, the word view came out as painting, because the translator just supposed that the artist was creating a painting of a view, and then he was arguing about the painting with his friend. Finally, there are much more structural problems that can happen when languages, and especially smaller ones, are over-dependent on translation. And this is related to a whole theory in translation studies and also in literature fields called the Polysystem Theory. And it basically tells us how the status of languages affects their relationship. And so if a language has more status or more prestige than others, it may have more dominance. And so when you try to, for example, translate from English into Basque or from French into Basque, maybe the French or English language structures will start interfering and coming into the language. And we have a very real example of this where the grammar of Arabic is actually shifting or changing as a result of translations and of multilingual effects. And those kind of grammar changes usually take centuries to happen, and they are usually very rare. But it's a complete shift in the standard order of the components of a sentence, from starting with a verb to starting with a subject. Which is a shift from the normal sentence structure in Arabic language to the dominant sentence structure in Latin languages that are now getting more and more, having more and more impact on Arabic. Overall, in translation studies, there are many issues with translations that are highlighted, but just to quickly go through them, and those are things we already discussed. The highlight or the conclusion here is that whenever we depend on translation to bring content to new and smaller languages, we will have to deal with the fact that the new content or translated content is always inferior to the original, because the original, for example, in English, will always have the full meaning, the full context, the full intentions of the author. But whenever you translate it, you're losing things. Either accidentally or by lack of incompetence or competence or other issues that we have talked about. And this always means that the translated text will have issues and will be of less reliable overall than the original one, and will contain less of the information intended, because it's just impossible for translators to always convey everything. And one last issue, but I think need to move on, is that over-dependency on translation and on content from foreign languages tends to make it more difficult for those people who are creating knowledge in smaller languages to hold this capacity or to have the sufficient expertise to create original content. Because when all you're doing all day is just translating, you will not gain the essential skills to do the research yourself, to gather the sources, to write your own content or knowledge. And this means that those smaller communities are losing the capacity over time. So what can we do about this? I cannot go in detail into the Wikipedia tools because we also need time for discussions. But I will just quickly highlight some of the things that we have. So we have had a tool called content translation for the past 8 years that is used in translating Wikipedia articles from one language to the other. And it has helped a lot in accelerating the new content, especially in smaller languages. It has had over 1 million articles that have been created since it was launched. And you can see a simple image of the interface on the right. We also have tools to translate the internal content on Wikimedia projects. This is not about the articles, but more about the policies and things like that. But we also have some automated translation tools, but they are not that well integrated yet. Some of the ideas for tools or for things that can help create this knowledge in smaller languages is first, things that can help us centralize the vocabulary, because we have talked a lot about vocabulary, and it is one of the major issues that we have in such languages. And the issue here is that, as we have said, those new terms keep coming from different sources, and they do not have any standard. And so what would help is to maybe have a single database or more of a central way to feed all the different terms into it, not only from projects like Wikipedia, but also from dictionaries or term databases or other existing sources in those languages, so that we can have a central place where we see all those dozen or so terms that are emerging to translate one foreign word or one technological term. One other thing that we really lack currently in knowledge platforms, open knowledge platforms in general, is translation memories. And this is one of the great technological advantages that are really underused for us, because translation memories not only save time, but they also can have the potential to improve the quality by the fact that they store the previous translations of a certain sentence, and they propose it to the translator. So in translation software, this is one of the most common features or the most desired features. And when you see, for example, a sentence, eventually language is composed of sentences that we really repeat. And so if you translate a repeat sentence, it just gets saved into the system. And when another person comes to translate the same sentence, they would just get a suggestion of the previous translations. This would help us on a project at the scale of Wikipedia. We have the potential to create an unprecedented translation memory, because most of the existing memories tend to be limited to just one company or even one individual translator who builds his or her own translation memory database. But if we start creating this at the level of millions of articles, we can create amazing memories that help us standardize those terms and the way we use language, by allowing us to reuse the same terms and the same translations over and over. Lastly, regarding the translation quality and issues like loss of meaning and other translation issues, there is really a lot of potential to crowdsource this in content review or AI methods that help us check what content is being mistranslated or what content is miscommunicated. One example of this is allowing the readers on websites like Wikipedia or other knowledge repositories to report parts of the content that are ambiguous or that are mistranslated or difficult to understand. And this can help over time detect the bad translations and even identify them by artificial intelligence to fix them. This is something that we, by the way, I think we already have to some extent on Wikipedia run by volunteers, but it would be on a very small extent. So this has been an introduction about challenges of multilingualism in open knowledge, about some of the solutions, and I'm going to leave it here. I think we have about 20 minutes remaining, so I'm going to leave it for any questions or discussion. And I see that my colleague Michelle would like to facilitate this part of the session, which is something I really welcome. So over to you, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you a lot for this interesting presentation. Personally, I get a lot of information and insights. And now I think it's the time for questions and discussion. So I can, yes.
I can just speak very loudly. Because it's in okay. Yeah.
It doesn't work like that.
I offer.
It's a technological school, so normally we can have to make. Normally.
Yeah. It's a technological school,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I
yeah.
admire all the advancements.
I hope so. Yes. Okay. Maybe you can.
Yes. So we start by Serge.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. And I have a question which may continue the one we had before. You address here single translations in some case. There is no strategy of automatic translation of parts of rich Wikipedia towards poor Wikipedia.
I would like to answer, but I'm waiting for that. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Currently, we do not have methods or tools to translate the Wikipedia of the content of Wikipedia automatically to other languages. It is done in some individual cases. It's usually not liked because if you automatically translate a whole article from let's say, I don't know, German and post it to Basque, and someone comes and read that, it would not look good for Basque Wikipedia because automatic translations tend to have poorer quality, of course, much poorer than human translations. And so what we're lacking maybe is more of a tool to for two things. First, a tool that may allow readers to auto-translate that content, but not to show it as the content of Basque Wikipedia, because that may hurt its reputation, but it should be clearly shown as something that is auto-translated. You need to have that clear expectation of whether you're reading a human translation or an automatic one. The other thing that I see is that automatic translations can be used to help editors translate things faster, and with the integration of things like translation memories, they can actually do it with better quality. However, this is something that we still do not have. So Wikipedia doesn't have its own machine translation tools, and this kind of technology may not even be still seen very positively by the community, so it has not been utilized so far. I hope this answers your question, but I also get that it's very overarching, so if there is something else you have in mind, feel free.
Another question concerning the MOOC, we address it that way. Since you're talking about knowledge, of course, it's very close to education, MOOCs. Do you have any strategy regarding this to provide tomorrow MOOCs in different fields?
Yeah. We have two kind of platforms / strategies maybe for this. So as we have mentioned, the wiki concept is not limited to Wikipedia. Wikipedia is the encyclopedia version of wikis. And the Wikimedia Foundation itself runs a dozen other wikis that have different kind of wiki-based content that is also open to everyone to edit and to use. And one of those is Wikiversity, which we have also talked about, and that is an open website, wiki website for learning and for education, for things like that. Unfortunately, it's still not being used that much, but it already exists in about 20 languages, and it has a content of a few thousand pages that are somewhat pretty much like MOOCs, although the interface might be less interesting than the ones for MOOCs. The other thing that we have, which has been launched recently as part of our 2030 strategy, is a learning platform that is pretty much MOOC-based, that is not intended for the readers or users of Wikipedia as much as it is intended for the community of contributors. So the contributors of Wikipedia themselves are a major community comprising hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And one of the strategies of our movement and of our organization is to develop the skills of those people so that they can make better contributions to the websites. And so we do have a platform called WikiLearn that is focused on developing those communities and giving them better skills in working on articles and on content and things like that.
Perfect.
Technological challenges. Working on them.
Signo su galera.
Hello, thanks for the presentation. One thing that maybe can be difficult to understand for people, and it's something I normally use the content translation, and I translate with machine translation also, but it's the only moment where two articles are quite similar is the moment you are going to publish the translation. So it's the only moment when you can actually do a translation memory, because from that moment they will diverge forever. And the original article will be adding or deleting content, and the translated article will be maybe focused on something more culturally related to them, or it won't evolve. So with his concern about why aren't we using directly translation, is because articles will be forever different. And I think that this is something that must be added to your presentation of the difficulty of having translation memory or automatic translation of everything, because there are cultural differences, and also the articles will diverge in the future.
Yeah, so Galder here raises a really good point, and by the way, he's one of the most veteran Wikimedians in the Basque area. So also, Galder, feel free to answer questions, by the way, and also Iñaki. The point being raised is that the content of Wikipedia, because it's open, because anyone can edit, it's ever changing. And so when we have an article from a certain language translated to another, the original article may change just a few days later, and so it may not be possible anymore to insert it into a translation memory and to understand, to match them together. I think this is more of a technological challenge. I would hope that we can, for example, go to the history of the article, because the history of each single entry on Wikipedia is always preserved, and maybe we can match it with the text, or we might also, it might be easier to do this during the translations. So we do have systems that are not yet integrated into Wikipedia, but they are used for the translation of internal policies and some other content that allow translators to break down the content sentence by sentence and translate it like a block by block. And this can be saved very easily into a translation memory. So I think we're pretty much losing on a major opportunity to get an amount of data on translation that is really unprecedented, and it is just not being used. I'm sure there are technological challenges, but I think it's something that we can overcome. But I will also add it to my future presentations, hopefully, that I do others.
Any other questions? Yes. Simon.
Yes. Sorry, maybe it's a good idea if you introduce yourself quickly before you ask, because I have not asked this.
I'm Simon. I'm working for STR since 4 years. I've been in the school before, but I get out in 2011. I get a question about your concept of knowledge and content, because you show us a lot of numbers about content, but don't you make any difference between the two concepts? And do you have any numbers of specific knowledge in the web, and how we can reach knowledge in different languages?
Yeah, so the question is about the difference between content and knowledge, right? Okay. So it's a fair question, and it's not something that I have dived a lot into, although in my job as knowledge manager, it's kind of an important question. So yeah, the differences between content is, I mean, it can be anything. I'm not sure like how we can define it, but I think even data may be something that qualifies as content. but maybe the levels that are easier to work with are the data, information, and knowledge. This is the usual hierarchy that we use in knowledge management. And so the data and information is kind of an essential difference, and I think most of you are familiar with. So you have like those numbers, or those, it can be also basic qualitative data, and then you draw conclusions from it and turn it into information that you can use. And technically speaking, most of the content in Wikipedia may qualify as kind of information. We call it knowledge in the sense that it's information that covers pretty much all the areas of knowledge in the world, like from physics to sciences to literature to even video games and singers and football players. All of that you can find on Wikipedia. Technically speaking, the difference between information and knowledge is not like that at all. So in knowledge management, knowledge is really the expertise or the expertise that is pretty much in people's heads. So it's not even something that you can easily write down or make tangible, because information is something that you read, but knowledge is what you gain and how you apply this information in your own decisions. So in this sense, Wikipedia may not qualify as knowledge, because it's not, the knowledge is really what we all have after we use this information and we gain it or internalize it. But this is more of the knowledge management definition. I'm sure there are other definitions by fields. So yeah, I don't know if this answers your question, but maybe the answer is that I should have used the word information more often in this presentation in order to be academically accurate, which is fair when speaking in an academic institution.
Any other questions? Yes, Benjamin.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm Benjamin. I'm yet to be graduated from this school. I'm already working here as a human factor specialist. I wanted to ask you, because you talked about tools for automated translation, and you talked a lot about like free knowledge, collaborative knowledge, and open source knowledge. For this kind of tools, do you use this kind of community-based design for software? I mean, like open source software and free software for designing this kind of tool. Is it like an open source project for this kind of automated translation tools? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Important question, and thank you for that. Also, good luck with your studies and to graduation. The current tools that we have are developed by either of two. So all of the tools, technologically speaking, all of the tools are based on MediaWiki. MediaWiki is the open platform on which Wikipedia is based. It's really old, but it's open source, and it's free, and it's based on the contributions of volunteers, 100% volunteers, almost, at least until recently. And so tools like those are typically developed by the volunteers on Wikipedia themselves, who many of them have technical expertise or are coders. The other source is that we also have the Wikimedia Foundation, which is kind of a central organization. It's a non-profit organization that tries to create new tools to support Wikipedia. And one of the goals, hopefully, of this presentation is that we're looking for potential collaborations between Wikimedia as an organization, as a volunteer community, and between academic institutions like STIA, which is also happening in many other places, by the way, around the world. Like, we have lots of partnerships, especially with academic and cultural institutions. So the Wikimedia Foundation, as this kind of central organization, has a major technology team that also develops some of those tools. So for the tool Translate Wiki, this is an old tool that we have had that has been developed, I think, by volunteers. And then on a more professional level, we have the new content translation tool, which helps translate Wikipedia articles. So yeah, I hope this answers your question, but happy to dive into more detail if that's of interest.
Other question? Someone? Jérémy.
Thank you, Abbad, for the presentation. As we discussed just before, I think that we have to involve more professor, more teacher to use open knowledge. Could be Wikipedia or, as I said, sometimes the teacher don't like Wikipedia. That's not my case, but yeah, no, I'm not for you.
Yeah, most of my teachers told me not to use Wikipedia. I tend to stay silent.
Okay, so do you have some idea in order to promote Wikipedia, in order to give more, not the teacher don't have to give knowledge, they have to stimulate the student in order to apply knowledge and increase their skills or their talent. That's my own point of view. Did you notice some good practice, maybe in different country? That's my specific question for your attention.
Thank you very much for being an advocate of Wikipedia for your students. I really admire that, and rarely see, not rarely, but yeah, many. That's even better, because it's free knowledge, it's not just Wikipedia. But maybe I can redirect that question towards my colleagues, because I do think that they have even better answers. And I'm happy to answer, but this is exactly what they're working on. It's Wikipedia and education. Of course,
actually,
all the best things are the best country.
No, there are a lot of good practice around the world. We in the Basque Country, we are running one long-standing program, like 5 years old, with nearly 5,000 students from universities. But we have learned that from other perspectives in the world. There's a really good one, for example, in Argentina, where they have a MOOC it's a MOOC for teachers on how to work with Wikipedia in a school. There is also a really good, there used to be, I don't know if they follow with that, there is a really good education program in the Czech Republic, for example, with students. There is also a really interesting program in Armenia, I think, where they work with, they make camps with the students, like 1 week, you know, a sport and then editing Wikipedia or something like that. I don't know how is the schedule, but they do, like, WikiCamp is called. There is a good program in Wales with secondary students, where they edit Wikipedia in Welsh language. And maybe the largest one will be the one run by Wikimedia Foundation. That is not the same as Wikimedia Foundation Education. I mean, there's Wikimedia Education and Wikiedu. It's not the same. This is based in the United States and Canada. And they have, I don't know how much, like, a lot of students, like yes, thousands of students also writing. Yeah. So there are a lot of programs around the world, and we are not alone. But it's true that in the last, maybe in the first 10 years of Wikipedia, it was like this renuance for teachers, like professors, like, oh, don't visit Wikipedia, it's not good. Then it was like 5 years, or well, maybe it's not so bad. And in the last year, I think it has shifted. And there is a lot of teachers and professors I know that they say this, you can, I mean, if you have a question that is not in the topic of my current classroom, you can read it in Wikipedia and it will be fairly good. So I think it's changing, but there are a lot of programs around the world, and there may be also some in the Levant that I don't know, and there is one I think very good in Cairo University, so there are other programs around the world. Or the one in South Africa where they have offline Wikipedia in schools with a computer in places that they don't even have Wi-Fi, and they provide a small computer who gives Wi-Fi to 10 or 20 computers, and they can read Wikipedia offline. So there are a lot of these kind of projects that are actually great.
Yeah, so as Galar is explaining, there's a whole other actually non-profit foundation that just works on the integration of education with schools and with Wikipedia and Wikimedia projects. And this is a spin-off of the Wikimedia Foundation, because this exact field that you're talking about is so popular and so has been so practiced around the world in many different universities that it requires its very own structure. So it's something that we pretty much work on, and there is lots of opportunities to connect about it. I hope this helps, and of course we will hopefully talk about this more after.
Maybe just to conclude, can you explain, Iñaki or Galder, how can a student from Estia become a contributor of Wikipedia, muy concretely, and in the same time just present rapidly the Wikibasque community, because you are close to Estia and maybe we can imagine some connections.
Well, Galder explained very well, since he's the coordinator from the education program, the Basque Wikipedia. But for just back to basics, how to contribute to the Wikipedia, you may be familiar by now, but the best way to start is to create your own account, and then, you have a draft or somewhere where you can test the contributions that you want to do, and perhaps you can start there just doing things, and that's in every language. So just the same for French, for Basque, and for English, and for whatever you want to try. And about our community, the community is a volunteer-based community, but in 2016, so we gathered together, and because up to that point we were just individuals that were pretty scattered, and we didn't know each other. And at this point we put together the Basque Wikimedians user group in order for coordination and to have synergies with other institutions. And so since that point there started to be, that was the cultural, European Cultural Year, 2016 in Donostia, San Sebastian, so 40 kilometers away from here. And there were some synergies with Basque institutions, and it started the education program based on the participation in the academic environment, and also secondary schools. And so there is the education program, and there is all the time a community around of volunteers that are adding content, and they are revising or reviewing the design of the articles, and this is the way it is working now. And it expands also to other projects like Wikimedia Commons, and more specialized into Wikidata, but that is what individuals do, or otherwise within the framework of the education program.
And also we are here in a technology institute. So not only writing Wikipedia, not only writing an encyclopedia, also contributing to technological imbalance, technological gaps is also possible. There is a platform, I don't know, I know the platform, but I don't know very good like the enrollment system there. Or you can also contribute with audio, videos, images, or other kind of knowledge. It's not only writing. I think the most easy way to start is just go in your language, go to your place you are living, or your hometown, or whatever, and see if you can add one sentence. And I think that this is the best way to start. And it's possible because normally you won't have a full article about any town in the world. So this could be maybe the easier way of starting. Easier than starting to write about the colonization of Mars. That is not so easy.
I have an anecdote about that, because 1 year ago I went to a conference here with a French journalist, Edoui Plenel, and I have seen Michel. So I asked Michel, what are you doing here? You come for the conference? No, just I have seen that in the Wikipedia, description of Edoui Plenel, the photography is from 10 years ago. So I came here just to take the photo and make the new photo on the description. So this is a contribution. I mean, it's not just a text or something. It can be just a photography. It can be something small to start and to conduct. So thank you very much to Abbad. Thank you, Iñaki and Galder, to be here. Maybe we can applause them. We will close here, and if you want to connect with them now, it's possible. Okay? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for listening.